Today I'm going to be reading Chapter 5 of the Geography of You and Me. When she woke, everything was blurry. As soon as she opened her eyes, Lucy brought an arm up over her face to block out the blazing sunlight. But several seconds passed before she remembered where she was. High up on the roof beneath a whitewashed sky, and several more went by before she realized she was alone. She rubbed her eyes, then propped herself up on her elbows, staring at the blanket beside her, where just last night Owen had fallen asleep, and which was now only an Owen-shaped indent, like a plaid flannel snow angel. They hadn't planned to sleep up here, but as the night had deepened and their voices had grown softer, slowed by the heat and the weight of the past hours, they found themselves lying side by side, their eyes fixed on the stars as they talked. Owen had fallen asleep first, his head tipping to one side so that his hair fell over his eyes, and he looked peaceful in a way he hadn't when he was awake. His hair smelled faintly of lemons from the cleaning solution on the floor of the kitchen. And Lucy listened to him breathe, watching the shallow rise and fall of his chest. Being there like that, so close to him, she had to remind herself that this wasn't real. It wasn't a date, but an accident. It wasn't romantic, only practical. They were just two people trying to make it through the night, and it didn't mean anything beyond that. After all, hours didn't necessarily add up in that way. Time didn't automatically amount to anything. There was only so much you could ask from a single night. Still, Lucy hadn't expected him to disappear completely. It was true that they'd made no plans for the morning, no promises for the next day. They'd shared nothing more than a blanket and some food and a little bit of light. But somehow, it had seemed like more than that, at least to her. And now as she glanced around the roof, empty except for a few pigeons milling about on the far side, she couldn't help feeling wounded by his absence. She rose to her feet, still squinting from the brightness of the morning, and shuffled over to the ledge. In the daylight, the city looked entirely different. The sky to the east was splashed with orange, and below it, Central Park was stretched out, a vast and manicured swath of wilderness interrupted only by the occasional pond, like dabs of blue-gray paint on a palette. Lucy stood with the breeze on her face, wondering whether the city had power again. It was impossible to tell from this high up. Downstairs, where she pushed open the door to her apartment, the answer quickly became clear. She held her breath against the wall of heat that greeted her, so dense it almost felt like something she could touch, and moved down the sweltering hallway and into the kitchen, where she stood staring at the place they'd been lying just last night, their heads close so that their bodies formed a kind of steeple. On one of the gray tiles, something thin and white stood out, even in the dim lighting, and when she stooped to pick it up, Lucy was surprised to find a cigarette. She wrinkled her nose as she examined it, trying to square this new fact, that Owen was a smoker, with her memory of the night before. Once again, she felt jolted by the realization that she didn't actually know him at all, and that those long hours together seemed to have lost something in the light of day. She was about to toss a cigarette into the trash when something made her stop. It was all that was left of this night. So instead, she grabbed her wallet from the kitchen counter, unzipping the little pocket that held all the coins, and slipped it inside. On the refrigerator, there was a small piece of paper with the number of her parents' hotel in Paris. By now, Lucy guessed they must have heard what had happened. She lifted the portable phone from its cradle on the wall, ready to dial the long string of numbers, but there was only silence on the line. No power meant no charge, which meant no dial tone. And so she hung up again with a sigh. The water wasn't working either. When she twisted the faucet, there was only a slow dribble that quickly petered out altogether. Without electricity, there was no way to pump the water up to the 24th floor. So she wiped out her forehead with the back of her arm and stood with a hand on either side of the sink, trying to figure out what to do next. There was a stillness in the apartment that she usually enjoyed when everyone was gone. But now, without even the hum of the appliances, the huge vaulted rooms felt strangely foreign, like it was someone else's home entirely. Lucy had never minded being alone. She was plenty used to it, with parents who traveled so much and brothers who weren't usually around. Unlike Lucy, who participated in absolutely no school-related activities, they had played basketball and lacrosse and were involved in student government. They led clubs and volunteered on the weekends and had even joined a band last year, though it was a largely ear-splitting affair that fell more into the category of noise than music. Lucy, on the other hand, had always drifted along, unseen at her school. She had a knack for making herself invisible that had always felt like a kind of superpower, something that belonged only to her. Being on her own had never been a burden. Instead of weighing her down, it buoyed her up. When she was alone, she was a lighter. When she was by herself, she felt untethered and free. But this morning, she was left with an uneasy feeling as she paced the empty apartment. A few years ago, on their first weekend without any supervision whatsoever, her brothers had turned to each other with matching grins the moment the door fell shut behind their parents. "What should we do first?" Charlie had asked, and Ben pretended to think about this, tapping his finger against his chin. "Well, we should probably eat a sensible breakfast." "Definitely," Charlie agreed, laughing as he grabbed a frozen pizza from the freezer. And after that, it had become a tradition: pizza for breakfast, just because they could. Now Lucy stood in front of the freezer, the last of the cool air leaking out, and ran a hand over the damp and wilting box of the frozen pizza she'd bought in preparation for her first time entirely on her own. After a moment, she had closed it again with a sigh, frowning at the calendar on the door. It was the first day of school, but the city was still stuck, dark, and gridlocked, and she was certain it would be postponed. This knowledge was neither welcome nor disappointing. It only meant that the countdown to the end of her junior year, to the end of high school really, would begin tomorrow instead of today. Lucy had always enjoyed her classes and endured her classmates, and these two things canceled each other out, resulting in a generally neutral attitude towards the whole endeavor. She'd been at the St. Andrew's School since kindergarten, and it was always the exact same. The same girls, the same uniforms, the same dramas and fights and scandals, the same catty conversations and ruthless jostling and mystifying objectives. Every year was like a rerun of the same boring show, everyone else moving fast all around her. A blur of people and plans and conversations, while Lucy remained alone in the middle of it all, standing absolutely still. She wandered into her bedroom and stood in front of the open closet where her plaid skirt and white blouse hung, pressed and ready to wear. But instead, with some amount of relief, she grabbed a pair of red shorts and a t-shirt, suddenly in desperate need for a walk. The now familiar temperature of the stairwell stung her eyes, and she wound her way down the steps again, passing neighbors too tired and sweaty to do more than raise a hand in greeting. They all wore the heat like a kind of weight, and Lucy, too, couldn't help feeling like something inside her was wilting. With each flight, the red numbers flashed by on the gray doors, but it wasn't until somewhere around the 16th floor that she realized she was no longer sure of her destination. Her intention had been to spend the rest of the morning wandering the neighborhood, but by the time she passed the 10th floor, she understood she wasn't headed outside at all. And she was all the way down to the 8th floor before realizing she was actually on her way to the basement. She was going to see Owen. But when she stepped out into the lobby, which needed to be crossed to reach the door in the mailroom that led downstairs, she was greeted by Daryl, one of the newer doormen, who was sitting at the front desk, drenched in sweat. "I feel like it's only fair to warn you," he said, mopping his forehead with a paper towel, "that it's hotter than hell out there." Lucy paused halfway between the elevator and the front desk. "Can't be worse than my apartment," she said, stealing a glance at the mailroom. "I don't know," Daryl was saying. "I walked in from the Bronx and—" Lucy turned back to him with wide eyes. "You did?" "Well, halfway," he admitted. "The subway's still down, and the buses were all packed, but I hitched a ride on the back of a fruit truck for part of it." "So everything's still a mess then," she said, and something about the tone in her voice made Daryl's expression soften. "It's not as bad as all that," he said with an encouraging smile. "I heard they got the power back upstate, and Boston too." Through the mailroom, she could see the far door swing open, and she caught her breath, surprised by the sudden quickness of her heart. It was only the handyman from last night, who waved as he turned the corner. Lucy sighed. "Hopefully we're next," she said, and Darryl nodded. "Where are you off to now?" "Nowhere," she said with a bit too quickly, and he laughed. "Sounds nice," he told her. "Be sure to send me a postcard." Once again, something seized inside her chest, and she hesitated for a moment, looking from the lobby doors back to the mailroom, hoping that Owen might come loping out. It would be so much better to run into him there. She was terrified of knocking on his door only to find that he didn't want to see her. Even now she could imagine the painful awkwardness of such an exchange, his face going red as he made some sort of excuse because he was too polite to tell her as much. After all, he was the one who'd left this morning. Lucy was normally a firm believer that things worked out for the best, and she usually had no problem being optimistic. But now she felt her legs go weak as she stood weighing her next move, her cheeks pink at the thought of showing up unannounced. Something about Owen had thrown her off, twisting her into uncertain knots. And so before she could do anything she might regret, she headed for the revolving doors that led to the street. Outside, it was clear that last night's celebrations had officially ended, and all that was left was the hangover. The streets, which seemed like one big party just hours before, were now full of sweaty, miserable-looking people, everyone fanning themselves with day-old newspapers. As she walked, Lucy saw a few kids chasing each other along the sidewalk, but otherwise, everyone seemed listless and beaten down by the weather. There were police officers stationed at the major intersections to direct traffic, but it was a haphazard affair, slow and grinding. All the energy seemed to have been sapped right out of the city. She pressed her way up the street, heading in no particular direction, as she had 1,000 times before. The ice cream shop from last night was now closed, along with most of the other stores, which were all shuttered and silent. A few blocks farther uptown, she passed her school, an imposing stone building where a handwritten sign on the door announced that classes would begin tomorrow, as long as the power was back, though there was no way to know if the note had been written yesterday or today. Finally, having covered most of the neighborhood, and with nowhere else to go, she made her way back home again. As she climbed the stairs, she considered heading back up to the roof in case Owen was there, and the thought propelled her up to the next 6th flight of stairs before she reconsidered it for the same reason she'd walk away earlier. She'd lived in the city her whole life, had gotten lost countless times at night, surviving 2 muggings and once broken her arm while climbing the rocks in Central Park. But it was in fact Owen, who wasn't scary in the least, but it was finally Owen who wasn't scary in the least, who had in fact been nothing but nice to her, who had somehow managed to turn her into a coward. Back in the apartment, she closed all the blinds and tried to nap on the couch, but the heat was oppressive and stifling. Wide awake and miserable, she paged through her well-worn copy of The Catcher in the Rye, the ultimate guide to losing yourself in New York City. But the words swam in front of her, blurry as everything else from the heat. Finally, she gave up and returned to the kitchen floor, which was only marginally cooler. As the late afternoon began to sink into darkness, the kitchen grew dimmer, and she pressed her bare arms and legs on the tiles and tried not to think about the fact that this was where they'd been lying just last night. She wondered if there was a word for loneliness that wasn't quite so general, because that wasn't it exactly. It wasn't that she was feeling lonesome or empty or forlorn. It was more particular than that, like the blanket on the roof this morning. Here in the kitchen, there was an Owen-shaped indent. She drifted to sleep there, her cheek pressed against the tiles, and when she woke, it was once again to a blur of light. Only this time it was coming from the bulb in the ceiling fixture, which was blaring down on her, harsh and unnatural and much too bright. She sat up so fast she felt dizzy, spinning around to see that it was back now, all of it. The blinking green lights on the microwave clock, the red numbers on the answering machine, the churning of the overhead fan, and beyond the doorway, the lamps that had flickered on across the rest of the apartment. All of the clocks were wrong, so she had no idea what time it was. But she shot to her feet and hurried from room to room, greeting each appliance like an old friend. Even the air conditioning had powered back up, and the stagnant air felt cooler already, all of it conspiring to make the apartment seem recognizable again. In her room, Lucy plugged in her computer and her phone, and while she waited for them to charge, she dashed over to their bathroom to test the water, which trickled out slowly, but enough for her to splash her face. She looked around, feeling giddy, wondering what to do first. Take a shower or try to contact her parents, or just simply sit in front of the fan, now suddenly a luxury. But on her way out of the bathroom, she paused in front of the living room windows, where the blinds were still drawn. She walked over and tugged on the cord, pulling hand over hand as the skyline revealed itself, inches at a time, all lit up in a brilliant patchwork of glowing windows, a checkered ode to the power of electricity. Lucy stood there for a long moment, taking it in, the city once again warm and bright as it was in her memory of it. But when she glanced up, she was surprised to feel an ache in her chest. High above the buildings, the sky had shifted, and there was now only a deep, unsettling darkness, as if last night's version of the skyline had been turned upside down, and the stars, every last one of them, had disappeared. That's the end of chapter 5. Thanks for watching.